Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this.
Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero.
How heroic he comes from.
If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
Oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
All right, welcome to this week's episode of the Sensible Socialist Podcast. I am your host, Kevin, and this week we're going to go back in time a little bit, a few years ago, and look at a conversation that I had with everyone's favorite awkward fellow, I would say, Stephan Molyneux. If you don't know who Stephan Molyneux is, it's hard to know exactly what to call Stephan Molyneux. I guess a public intellectual of some kind of sort. He is, I would say, on the sort of libertarian political area. He does have interesting ideas of disconnecting from your family and other ideas, other weird things like that. But for a while, and I'm not sure he's doing it anymore, but for a while on his Free Domain, I think, radio show, he would just take in calls. And I had listened to a few of them, and I was pretty annoyed by them. And this is about my second year of law school, and so I decided I wanted to call in and see if we could have a decent conversation and get maybe some, I think, confusing points that he says or holds a little bit hammered down. And so you'll see that it kind of ebbs and flows, and there are good parts and less good parts, but as we go through it, if there's anything that I think I need to make a comment on, I'll just kind of stop the recording and jump in. But for the most part, it's basically just going to be the conversation that we did have. It was a few years ago, but in general, I think many of the things that I argue would be something I would argue now. So that's why I figured this might be the right time to do it. The other reason is I am feeling slightly under the weather, and just a programming note, I suppose. I will be gone out of the country for the next few weeks, so there won't be any episodes for about 2 weeks, and but I'm going to take that time also to plan out some episodes and make the connections so that we can hit the ground running when we come back. So no episodes for the next 2 weeks, and this one is a conversation I had with Stephan Molyneux, just feeling a little under the weather. Normally I would review the news and go over that, but basically this week's news, especially in the U.S., has just been dominated by the continuing government shutdown. So the government shutdown is now the longest in U.S. history, and there have been several meetings to attempt to rectify it. Meetings between Donald Trump and the Democrats do not usually go well, and then both sides seem to go out and complain about the other on national television. So that's a little annoying, but because nothing is getting done, and now we're at the first week where people are not getting paid. Air traffic controllers, TSA, and a number of different people still have to work during the government shutdown, but are not being paid. They will supposedly be getting paid at the end of the shutdown, whenever that is going to be. Remember that Donald Trump did say this could go on for months, if not years. So we'll see how this goes. This will be what dominates the headlines for the foreseeable future. And so while I am out of the country, I will no doubt be keeping tabs upon it. So with that being said, I won't keep you any longer, and here is an honest conversation with Stephan Molyneux.
You assert that the redistribution of wealth and or transfer of property rights from the bourgeois, owning class, to the proletariat, the working class, necessarily uses forces in violation of the non-aggression principle. But doesn't the exploitation of labor by the owner do much of the same thing, or at a minimum have the same effect? Could one claim that the working class expropriation of the means of production be considered self-defense under the non-aggression principle? That's from Kevin.
Hello, Kevin. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great, Steph. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. I'm doing well. Exploitation. Exploitation. Let's start off with some definitions. And what's your take and swing at the word exploitation? How would you define it?
Well, I mean, in terms of economically, exploitation is the extraction of value based off of the labor of someone else. The sort of standard Marxist view is that if you look at the relationship between an owner and a worker, the worker actually uses their labor power in order to produce a certain commodity or a certain number of commodities, the value of which the owner then in the marketplace actually charges a higher value than what they paid for it. And that difference, obviously what we usually call profit, is basically a measure of the taking by the owner of the surplus value that the laborer has created. And that is what I would say is the best definition of exploitation.
Okay, so basically it's extracting value from the labor of others.
Right.
Now, during this conversation, do you anticipate that I will be expending labor?
Not necessarily. I mean, I get not physical labor, not necessarily productive labor.
What do you mean not physical labor? Is my mouth not moving?
I guess technically yes, your mouth moves, but I mean in terms of sort of economic productive labor, it's a little different. So it's not producing. It's not
hang on. You said it was the extraction of value from the labor of others. So in this conversation, I'm not trying to be annoying. I'm just trying to make sure we started from the same place. So in this conversation, I will be putting in labor. I assume that you, since you're doing this rather than something else, that you are expecting or anticipating to receive value out of this conversation, right?
Not economic value, but yes, value as in the terms of something worth something, like the discussion will get somewhere or provide some interesting context or whatever like that, but not necessarily economic value, not something that we could say exchange necessarily for something that would be valuable, either another commodity or money, which is the just an embodiment of exchange value.
Okay, so it's not the exchange of value, because this is why the definitions are so important. It's not the extraction of value from the labor of others, because if I give you something helpful in this conversation, then of course it would be of value to you, right? And I would be doing labor in order to achieve that. Now, it's not one-sided, because I will also be getting value out of you in this conversation, and that's perfectly fine. So it's not value as a whole. It is the extraction of economic value. Is that right?
Yeah, and particularly the surplus value. So the extraction of value beyond what is it's the extraction of the value produced beyond what you pay.
Right. Okay.
In wages.
Now this occurs. We'll just take the typical scenario of the factory and the factory owner, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's take as market-friendly a situation as possible, and we're not going to deal with inherited wealth. Or let's just start off sort of easy, because I really do want to understand this. Mm-hmm. So, if I am a worker, which I was, I started a factory. I co-founded a company and grew it fairly well. And so I had been learning how to work with computers since I was like 11 or 12 years old. I'd go in every Saturday and I'd work with the computer lab, and I'd sign the computers out, and I'd keep them at home, and I'd learn how to program them and all that kind of stuff. And I put a huge amount of unpaid labor to learn all of that stuff. I also read a lot of business magazines and a lot of business books and so on, and took a course or two, not economics, but history with some economics in.
and then did a lot of unpaid labor to sort of build a product with the person I co-founded the company with. And so we then ended up building something that we could sell, and then took out loans and sold equity and hired, built got the computers and rented out the office space. And I won't go through the whole list, but it's a huge amount of unpaid labor and time that you have to put in, at least I had to put in order to be in a position to hire people. And then I hired people who then worked on the coding and worked on other things that needed to be done in the business.
Sure.
And I took on risks that they didn't take on, which was perfectly fine. I mean, I co-signed loans that would have ruined me if we hadn't survived and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the person who I then hire is gaining the benefit of all of that unpaid labor. So if we were to be paid the same, that would be unfair, because the person I hired made less than I did and did not have equity, at least at the beginning, in the company, but they also hadn't put in the thousands of hours of unpaid labor that I had put in order to start the business. So that person is getting economic value from my labor, right? My labor in building the business, which they can then step into and start to use. So I am getting surplus value out of them, and that I hope to sell their labor for more than I'm paying them. But they're also getting surplus value, economic value out of me, insofar as they don't take the risk or do the unpaid labor that it took to start the business. And that's my sort of experience, but you could transfer that very easily to a sort of more traditional factory situation. What are your thoughts?
Sure. Well, my thoughts on that are I follow you. I understand you up to that point. Until up to the point. So, as the person who starts a factory, or you're in your situation, you do all the work, the upfront work, as they call it, to sort of get it all up and running. So when you're at the point of being able to, you sort of have an entity, you have space, you're ready to hire workers. It's totally understandable, both sort of economically as well as, say, morally, or morally is that's the best word, and to essentially enter into what amounts to a contract with the people that you employ that says, I will employ you at such and such a price, but I'm going to, for a period of time, such that I'm able to recoup what I have already I'm already down, I've already lost. There's a lot of unpaid labor that's gone into getting us here, and therefore I need to then recapture that investment. If you made that agreement, I don't necessarily have a problem with that. The issue that I have, the problem that I have, is that what happens in these kinds of arrangements is that the person in the position of ownership recoups their loss, either through the extraction of the surplus labor over a period of time, such that they've made up what investment they have put in, either through unpaid labor or their own actual capital or whatever. But once they have essentially been benefited, they've been given back the benefit that they have expended, any extraction of surplus labor after then is, in my view, unjustified, not necessarily moral, and is economically unfeasible in the long run, because it.
Okay, so hang on. Let me just, sorry to interrupt, but let me sort of try and respond to that.
Sure.
Okay, so let's say that the worker owes me, when we start, $100,000.
Okay.
In other words, for me to have done all the work that I'm just picking a number, it could be 10,000. Let's just say 100,000. But let's say the worker, when I hire them, they owe me $100,000, because that's what they owe me for having set up the business. Now, I don't charge them $100,000 and then make them a full equity partner. Although, to be fair, the worker could do that, right? The worker could say, listen, I want to buy in equity in the business. I am going to put in $100,000 investment. I want to buy part of the business, and they could become a part owner of that business, right? But if they don't want to do that, and when you're young, I didn't, and the people I hired didn't usually want to do that, they say, okay, well, I'm not going to be able to give you the $100,000 I owe you for doing all the work to set this business up and to be in a position to hire me. So I'm going to just pay you out of every paycheck. I'm going to pay you 10% value out of every paycheck for you having created the business and done that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, are you saying at some point, like a house, that is at some point paid off?
Right.
Right. Except not really, because the business of running a business is one of continual improvement, right? You've got to upgrade the computers, you've got to expand the offices, you've got to go scout new locations, you've got to find new customers, and all of this is very expensive and an ongoing cost, which the employee has to pay for at some point. I mean, really, it's the customers who pay. But it's the employee who has to contribute to all of that. There's no point having programmers if there aren't any salespeople out there selling the product, right? Because so and there's no point having people out selling the product if there are no programmers to either make or upgrade or improve the product and so on. So I'm not sure where it ends up that you stop upgrading. If you sort of think of a traditional factory, they're constantly upgrading the machinery. They have to put in, when regulations change, they have to put in more pollution filters. They have to put in wheelchair ramps for accessibility. They have to upgrade for safety and so on. And there is, of course, an ongoing risk that the owners take, which the employees don't take.
Right. So there's
like if you're an owner and the business goes bankrupt, you can be personally liable depending on your contracts. You can be personally liable for, but if the business goes bankrupt, the employees just walk away.
Right. So there's two different sort of ways of looking, or you've sort of gone in two different directions. One are your sort of costs of business. These are costs of doing business. And in most situations, I mean, in maybe not the smallest kind of entities, but in a sort of medium-sized or large-sized business, the business entity either begins as or becomes a sort of legal entity in itself. And so it can, and this can be in, with agreement with employees and everything, it can build up its own capital for which it will then reinvest its own money. The individual capitalist, the individual who may have started it and may or may not have liabilities depending on how they set up the entity. That means that the business could sort of reinvest money that it may extract, the surplus labor it may extract from the employee, but may do so to reinvest back in the business. That's one thing. That shouldn't, in a sort of successful business, or at least one that isn't in the beginning stages, ought to be paid by the business itself. And
hang on.
If it can't do that, then it's not as
sorry
to
interrupt. Wait, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, if I'm the business owner, and let's say the business makes $1 million, then I can take that $1 million out of the company and keep it for myself, right?
Sure.
Now, if I do that, though, I'm not reinvesting in the business, and it's going to be short-term gain, long-term pain, right? Because worker productivity is the key, and worker productivity is dependent generally on how much you're willing to reinvest back into your own business. Like if you want to run I'm sorry?
Or how much you think you have to reinvest, right? You might not say, you could say out of that $1 million, well, the business only needs, say, $200,000 to put into an account for, what we see are upcoming costs, and I'm going to pocket the $800,000 that's left. And you could do that.
You could, but if there's market value in investing $500,000 and you only invest $200,000, then your competitor across the street who invests $500,000 will probably end up outcompeting you. So it's a balance, right? Whereas on the other hand,
yeah. But
whereas on the other hand, if everybody takes all of the profits, like if I take all of the profits and invest it back into the business, like if I work for $1 a year and put all the money back into the business, that is really not a sustainable business model, because if I get hit by a truck, there's an artificial profit there, which is me not taking a salary, which if I need to be replaced, if I decide I want to go pick grapes in Queensland or become a mime, or as I say, get hit by a bus, then you have an artificial subsidy, which is the owner not taking a regular paycheck. And so that's not sustainable. So it's some balance where you have to pay people enough in management that they're going to want to do a good job. But at the same time, you also have to reinvest back into the business. Now, the money that you reinvest back into the business is another loan that you're making to the employees, right? Because you're now lending. Let's say you make $1 million, you put $500,000 back into the business. Well, that's $500,000 that you're, quote, lending to the employees. So I'm not sure that it ever kind of gets paid off. You could say it gets paid off if you simply stop reinvesting anything in your business, but that's a decaying orbit scenario.
Well, and when it would be a debt to, or the sort of from you to them if you paid it out of your own pocket. But if it's money that's generated by the business activity or the productive activity of the business, then it's not a loan from you to the employees. It's value that the employees have generated that would otherwise go to you, which you are then deciding to go back into the business. When the business is what's making the value, the sort of capital.
No, hang on. So let's say I'm 100% owner of the business makes $1 million. I have the perfect right to take that $1 million out.
The employees make the $1 million. Well,
no, the business as a whole makes the $1 million.
Well, right, but the people who do the work that produces the value in a business are the people who work at the business. So the
Which
workers,
is everyone.
well,
the managers
not necessarily.
work too.
Well, it's everyone who produces, whose value can be attributed to the total value of the product. It's useful labor. It's actually, there's a lot of idle labor in quote unquote idle labor.
Wait, one thing at a time. One thing at a time. Let's make off an idle labor. No, not just yet. We're trying to keep this as simple as possible at the beginning.
Okay.
So if the business as a whole, which I'm managing, if it makes $1 million and I'm 100% owner, then I have that $100 million. Sorry, I have that $1 million. I can take that $1 million and put it right in my bank account and then give half of it to the bank, to the government, because I'm in Canada, high taxes, right? Now, if I take $500,000 instead of $1 million, then that is a direct return of half of my income back into the business.
How do you generate?
Right, so that's what I mean when I say the business makes $1 million. I'm reinvesting it back, and that is a kind of loan to the future productivity of the workers, which they are liable for in terms of a reduced salary. And the reason they'll take that reduced salary is because it actually increases their salary, right? So for me to reinvest in the business makes the employees more productive. It makes, we get faster computers, we get better graphics cards, we get faster rendering time, whatever it's going to be. We get better tools, better equipment, we get a nicer office, whatever it's going to be. So whatever it is that I'm reinvesting, they continue to take that loan, and they take that loan because it's better for them than not taking the loan, because it's a sustainable and growing business out of that.
Yeah, and that may be a decision that the employees are making, it given the sort of limited decisions or the limited choices that they have, and there may be a certain amount of logic to that. But the larger point is, by you saying, okay, the business generates $1 million, therefore I get $1 million, right? There's a sort of equating the person to the entity. You are the business because you're asserting 100% ownership rights over that business, which means that all of the value that's created beyond what you have to pay for is your money. Is that right? Would that be fair to say?
Well, again, I'm sorry, after saying let's keep it as simple as that, it's not, there's $1 million profit. However, that's not the total amount that the business makes, right? I mean, there's the gross and then there's the net, as you know, right? And so the employees are getting back some value, and I'm getting back some other value, and the value that I get back is larger because I created the business and I need to be paid for all the unpaid labor that I brought into the situation and the risk and all that.
Let's say you're paid for that unpaid labor. We're in a position where you have been paid for your unpaid labor. So this is there's $1 million in profit that the business has generated that you are then going to take and decide what you want to do with it. So So the issue there, that is in some ways my issue, because what you're saying is that the employees have at that business, which may or may not involve you if you're doing managerial work or you're taking a sort of paycheck or you're actually paying yourself a wage from the business. But if you're not, let's say you're just, sort of waiting for the monthly check to come in.
No, sorry. We can't jump out of this scenario yet.
Okay.
Because if we can't find hang on. If we can't find exploitation in this scenario, then we need to look for some other definition. That's why we have this scenario at the moment.
Right. So there's a few fundamental questions then. We're assuming that the scenario, you have some assumptions. That one, the initial investment in terms of unpaid labor that you have invested or capital or whatever has been paid back. We can assume that.
No. My whole argument was that it can never be paid back because I'm continuing to work, I'm continuing to expand my skills, and I'm continuing to forego making money from the business and turning it into my personal income in order to reinvest in the business. So it can never be paid off. It's like saying, can I ever pay off a house where I'm continually upgrading it every single year? Well, no, because you may pay off the original house, but by then you've got to pay for the deck and the swimming pool and the tennis courts and the helicopter landing pad and the gold faucets. If you continue to upgrade the house every year, then you can't ever pay it off. And since business owners tend to upgrade the capital equipment that the employees use every single year and expand and grow and take more risks and do partners and have to hire legal departments and all the stuff that and compliance departments and human resources departments, all the things which the employees usually don't see and interact with directly, because you're continually reinvesting in the business, the initial loan can never be paid off.
And no, the issue there is that your continual reinvestment is reinvestment of money that's been generated by the labor of the people who work at the business. So it's not an analogy. Your house is not an analogy because the paying off the house takes money that the house itself doesn't generate to purchase. So it's not, the house is not generating the money that you're reinvesting in the house and thereby loaning.
Well, so switch it to a hotel. It doesn't matter. Just switch it to a hotel then.
The hotel's money is generated by the hotel's money is generated by the labor that goes into maintaining that business. So
no,
yes,
no, that's factually incorrect.
If there were well, part of it is the fact that they're just renting, so that it is somewhat of a different thing. But if you didn't have people who worked there, it wouldn't work. I mean, there needs to be some kind of labor. And if they didn't have something to work in, if they didn't have something to work in, their labor would be completely valueless. And I'll give you a 30-second example, right? So I used to work as a waiter. Now, somebody had to build that restaurant. They had to order the plates. They had to order the food. They had to pass the health and safety inspection, everything. They had to pay the electric. Now, if there was no plates, no restaurant, no chairs, no customers, and I was just standing in a field wandering around back and forth, and I would be paid no money. You have to wrap the worker in something that's economically productive in order for the labor to have value. So it's true, and this is why it's a symbiotic relationship. The capitalist creates the environment that makes the workers that much more productive. But saying the only reason the hotel generates money is the workers is saying, okay, well, let's take the same people and let's put them underwater. Let's put them on the moon. Let's put them in a field. They're not going to make a damn thing. You need the capital stuff around you in order for your labor to be valuable. Yes, I mean, obviously you need a place to that and tools and all of those different things to be able to be productive. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that once that gets going, the idea of a business is that it's self-sustaining, so that it produces its own. It doesn't even produce its own value or what it needs to maintain itself, but it actually produces the value enough to be able to grow and to do more. So I mean, it's.
I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean. It produces enough value to grow and do more. I'm not sure what that means.
The idea of a successful business is a business that generates more money than it spends, and that allows that business to then expand, or depending on the situation, either give dividends or whatever. But it allows the company to continue on and to hopefully grow, which is the sort of point of any business, is to be able to.
No, I get all of that, more. But I still, I know, I've been an entrepreneur. I know all of that. Okay. But so because it needs to expand and continue to grow, and of course people quit or you have to fire them or whatever, and then you've got to go out and find new people, which is very time consuming and has its own risks as well. And so you're continually needing to invest more and more money in the business, which means that the employees are never going to get the quote loan paid off because there's continually additional loans being made to them in order to expand or even just maintain the business. Having a car, it decays, everything wears out. You can, even if you don't want to expand or grow, you still have to, plates get broken in a restaurant. Your oven wears out. The heating, ventilation, and air conditioning has to be replaced because it's old or the regulations change or whatever it is, right? So it never ends. There's the initial business thing, and then just even to maintain a single restaurant you never want to grow can cost quite a bit of money, and that's money that the employees don't pay, so you lend them that money, which is why you continue to take additional profits from their labor. That's the payback for the loan that you're giving them, which makes their labor that much more valuable. What makes it valuable at all?
Okay. The thing is on that is that if you're suggesting that the profit is what is being paid to the worker, right? In this sort of second round of investment, that then they have to pay back through the exploitation of their, or not the exploitation, but the extraction of their surplus value. What you're assuming in that is that all of the profit that's generated by the labor of the employees is transferred to the individual owner, and then the owner decides to reinvest that, rather than a certain amount of value being being generated by the employees that can then be used by the business itself, that essentially being everyone that's working there, to make those investments. So it doesn't have to depend on necessarily the owner making that investment, thereby allowing them to continue to extract the surplus labor. They can basically the organization does that itself by producing value over and above the amount it costs. So the issue that I have in this whole thing,
I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. Hang on.
Let me explain it if you don't know it.
No, I don't, Kevin. I don't know what you're talking about, and I have to interrupt you when I don't know what you're talking about, because I don't want you to just nod glassily into the camera here and pretend I know what you're talking about.
Okay. Well,
so I'm not trying to interrupt you because I want to break your flow. I don't know what you're talking about. I mean, we just went through the scenario where the business makes $1 million, and I, as the business owner, rather than keep that $1 million, I keep half of it and reinvest half of it back into the business. And I thought we'd sort of agreed that that was the scenario. And now I'm not sure what you're talking about. I just got confused. That's all.
Well, we'll do it this way then, just so I don't confuse you. What I would say is that if your income from the business is the profits of the business, and you decide to reinvest 500, half of that money back into the business, the way to look at that, you can look at it two ways. One, I'm investing this back in the business, therefore they owe me. Or the business has basically, I have not taken that much. The business has retained that $500,000, and it's then making the purchases that it's doing, and I'm retaining the $500,000.
Wait, what in this scenario? What is the business? I don't. That's a piece of paper. It doesn't make any decisions at all. I'm not sure what that means.
The business is the business. It's the building it's in. It's the workers who work at it, and it's the machines or whatever it is that it takes to do whatever production is being done there.
So but none of those things make the decisions about the profits. The building doesn't, the workers don't, unless you have a particular kind of business.
Well,
and so I have the right to take the million. I have the right to take the $1 million as the owner. If I decide to reinvest half of that money back, that's a decision an individual has to make. I mean, I don't know where the abstract term business comes in.
Because there are many, now maybe not in this necessarily scenario, but there are many situations in which the sort of business decisions about what the business is going to do is not made by the person who gets the profit check. So there are a lot of entities that are not owned and controlled, and all of the decisions are made by one individual.
No. Kevin, we got a rule here. And the rule is we're dealing with a particular scenario. You keep wanting to break off and go into other scenarios.
The scenario that you presented is useful for you because the way that situation works sort of proves your whole point. But it isn't how things actually work. So you can make
What do you mean? Hang on. Dude, are you really going to tell me, who's been an entrepreneur for about 30 years, that I have no idea how things work in the entrepreneurial world? Do you really want to take that path with me?
Well, I didn't say that, Steph. What I said was...
You said this is not how things really work.
What I'm saying is this example that you're using is not necessarily how many businesses are run. Right? There are decision-making processes all the way through.
Oh my God! Do you not know how to? Oh God. Okay, I could just for the audience. Maybe you know, maybe you don't. Okay, so the way that philosophy works is you put forward a theory, and here the extraction of economic value from the labor of others is exploitation, and exploitation, of course, has a negative connotation, right? So I created a scenario, which is a very real-world scenario that I myself lived through for many years, in where the extraction of economic value from the labor of others was not exploitive. And that doesn't mean that there's no exploitation in business. I'm sure that there is. But what it means is that we need a different kind of definition then. right? We need a different kind of definition, because if the scenario that I put forward, the guy who starts a business and he ends up, taking $1 million out of that business and then putting $500,000 back into the business and so on. If that scenario is not exploitive, then we need to refine our definition. That's all. So this is why I keep pulling you back into this scenario, because we're trying to figure out, is our definition of exploitation, the extraction of economic value from the labor of others, is our definition of exploitation comprehensive and valid? Now, if in this scenario it's not exploitive in a negative way, and I think we can both admit that it isn't, then we need to further refine. It doesn't cast out your definition of exploitation. It simply means that we need to refine it. Like we could say the extraction of economic value from the labor of others when you've done nothing to create that value, or whatever. But this is how we have to have a debate. We can't set up a scenario to test a hypothesis or a definition, and then we can suddenly just jump off as if we're talking about something else. We never get anywhere there.
Right. Okay. So yeah, I mean, you could add, if we want to redefine the definition, we can, and I think just adding that little last part is probably not a bad place to start. So exploitation is the extraction of economic value from a productive laborer by a, say, non-productive entity, usually a person, right? So it's productive value extracted and then taken by a person who contributes no labor, or whose value they're getting far outweighs the actual value of the labor that they put into the business.
Right. Okay, so we and I appreciate your patience with this. So we've refined, which is the point of the Socratic dialogue. We've refined the definition, and just tell me if I've got this right or not. It's the exploitation is the extraction of economic value from the productive labor of others where you are unproductive.
Sure. Yep.
Okay. Now the problem is that includes babies.
What do you mean? How do babies produce value?
No, babies are not productive, but they extract economic value from the productive labor of others, right? You've got to buy them a crib, you've got to buy them food, you've got to buy them toys, you've got to buy them onesies, you've got to buy them diapers, and you have to do a lot of labor. So you're expending a lot of money. So again, we just have to further refine the definition, because babies and children and so on extract economic value from the productive labor of others when they are unproductive. And this is also true of charity, right? So people who are receiving charity are getting economic value from the productive labor of others while they themselves are unproductive. So we just have to keep, this is part of the whole process, right? We just have to keep refining the definition until we can figure out what fits the best scenarios, the best general scenarios.
Yeah, so you could just add another sort of clause at the end, right? So it's the extraction of value from productive labor by an unproductive person who does so. Let's see, who does so based on their position as an owner, say, or because of the assertion of an economic right. That being the right.
Well, no, but hang on. Those two are not the same, because if you're an owner, then you automatically are providing economic value by letting other people use your property, right? So if I own a restaurant and people work there, they're gaining value because I'm letting them use my restaurant, and then they're not carrying dandelions around in a field. So we can't say owner. It has to be something else.
Why can't explain that to me again? That was very confusing.
Sure, sorry. So if I own a car, right, and you want to rent my car, then I am automatically providing you value because I own the car, right? So I've ended up at the ownership in some manner. We don't have to figure out exactly why. But by lending you my car, I've automatically provided value. So it can't be just that you're the owner and therefore you're not productive. You are productive because you're lending other people your property in order to allow them to increase the value of their labor.
That suggests that property has value, like it just has sort of inherent value. Is that an assumption that you take? So if you have something, let's say a building or a piece of...
If I pick my nose, my booger is mine, but I don't know if I'm going to get a lot for it on eBay. So I don't know that property has, we spend a lot of money to take the property called human feces and move them as far away from our bathrooms as humanly possible, right? Although if I take a crap on your lawn, it's me who's arrested for vandalism or whatever it is. So I don't think all property has value. If you own your own appendix, but if it's about to kill you, it's really good if somebody goes in and saws it out with a chainsaw or something. So I don't know that I would argue that all property has value.
So how is it that just by means of ownership of some kind of property, you, by allowing someone else to use that or say occupy it, if it's a piece of land, do you confer economic value?
Well, because the person wants to use it. Like, so if I build a house and somebody wants to live there, then it has value for them because they want to use that property.
But does it have economic value in terms of, so it might have value to the person, right? Even if the person is sort of willing to pay for it, but does that have economic value in such that it can generate additional value? Because I think that's an important distinction. A business can generate additional value. Its production generates value. A business that doesn't have any, and it does so through its employees. If a business doesn't have any employees, it doesn't have any, or it isn't able to produce any economic value. Therefore, if you were to have an idle factory and you were to allow someone to walk through an idle factory, it's not as if you're conferring on them any sort of economic benefit, right? It's only if there's production happening there, is there any sort of even possibility of conferring any kind of benefit? And it's only conferring it based on this notion that you have the ability to own this piece of property, which is an issue that I don't know if you want to get into. We can get into that, but I think that is a problematic issue because it allows for the idea that you can somehow transfer value, economic value, merely by your position as owning that piece of property and allowing someone else to use it. And I think that is a sort of phantom value that we have created in our own minds and over the course of a long history of sort of theoretical development, but that has as its basis a system that isn't actually related.
I'm sorry, I got to interrupt you because I got kind of lost at the beginning. I don't know what you're talking about, but if I had to guess, I would say that it's something like there are productive goods and consumptive goods. So there are goods like a house that we do not expect to make money out of. Maybe you could make money if you sell it and it goes up in value, but you have a house because you need to keep the rain off your head, and so you have a house. Whereas there are other things that you will buy that you will expect will make money. So if you buy a car just to drive around and enjoy yourself, that's a consumptive good. But if you buy a car so that you can turn it into a taxi and rent it out for money, or you want to make Uber money or whatever, then that's a productive good. So is that what you're talking about? There's a difference between goods which you consume without them making money, and then there are goods which you purchase in order to hopefully generate future income.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a huge difference.
Okay. I don't know what that has to do with anything, but I certainly accept that there are those two economic classes of property.
Okay. Well, and I think so, whereas the sort of non-productive property, there isn't really much of an idea with ideas of ownership of that kind of property or anything like that. When it comes to the productive property, for lack of a better term, that's where I find the problematic. Problematic that those ideas that those kinds of entities can be owned by individuals who then, by their position of owner, can at some point be able to extract value from the production that's going on at that property, that then they can add no value to that, but they can take what value is generated from that. I find that sort of morally problematic, but also economically problematic.
Okay, so I can own personal property. So if I buy a laptop because I want to watch Netflix and play video games, that's fine. But if I buy a laptop because I want to record audiobooks and sell them for money, that's bad.
Well, no, because that's you doing it. That's your own labor. You're inputting labor into it. If you want to buy a computer for the sole purpose of charging someone to use that computer, do some kind of economic activity, I think that there's a problem with that.
Okay, so we've got three classes now. So there's a class of computer that you use for personal consumption. That's not fine. That's fine for you. There's something which you use for your own economic productivity, and that's fine. But if I buy a computer and then I charge people 50 cents an hour in some remote African village because they want to check email or browse the web or whatever, then that's bad.
Yeah.
So
well, it's not,
consumption is good. Productivity, consumption resources are good. Productive resources are bad, but are good, but rental resources are bad. Is that right?
The ownership of those, not them in themselves are bad, but the ownership of those things such that you're able to extract from other people value. That's the issue.
Okay, so if I buy the laptop and I rent it out for 50 cents an hour in some remote African village, clearly I can't use the laptop while I'm renting it out, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I have spent money on a laptop which I can't use because I'm renting it out. So it's a net negative for me. In other words, it would be charity if I simply bought notebooks and handed them out for free or let people use them for free or whatever. But if we look at sort of economic value, if I buy a laptop and then let people rent it out, then that's a net negative for me because I bought property which I can't use because other people are taking temporary ownership of it. Like when I go to give a speech somewhere, and if I rent a car, then the people who bought the car to lend it to me can't use it and can't lend it to anyone else while I've got sole ownership of it. So car rental businesses would be bad. So if I buy a car for fun, that's fine with you. If I buy a car and use it to make money through Uber or something, that's fine with you. But if I rent a car, the person who rents the car to me is bad.
Well, it's again different in that because it's not bad in the sense that there's nothing wrong with the car, right? What's wrong with is what you're doing with it and how you're getting the value from it. And again, it's very important that I don't have a problem with there being arrangements such that you're able to recoup whatever it is of the original cost. If you have a cost that goes into something, it's understandable to sort of demand or to create a situation where you're going to be paid back for it. But if you buy a car and you rent it out and you're paid back the full value of that car, and you continue to then rent it out and therefore extracting surplus value, I think that's problematic. But it really,
you cannot, dude.
reality,
my God, have you ever run a business? I'm just curious about this.
Have I ever run one? No. Have I been involved in?
So this all
have I started?
Stuff. Okay. If you buy let's say I buy a car and the car is going to last for 10 years, right? And I buy the car and I have to put, let's just say it's a $20,000 car. So I have to take $20,000 out of my bank account and give it to the people who make the car. And then there's gas, maintenance, and depreciation, right? So wear and tear, depreciation as a whole, plus the ongoing costs of the car. So you tell me, if I take that $20,000 car and let people drive it for 8 hours a day, and I'm responsible for gas, oil, maintenance, washer fluid, getting it cleaned, getting it sprayed, people smoking it, I got like all of that stuff. When is it paid off? I'll tell you when it's paid off. It's paid off when it goes to the junkyard or I sell it secondhand or whatever it is, right? So there's at no point and this is just competition in the marketplace. So if I spend $20,000 on the car and then I spend another $5,000 or $10,000 a year maintaining it, let's just say $5,000 a year maintaining it, and that goes on for 10 years, that's $50,000 plus the $20,000. That's $70,000 accumulating over 10 years. Now, I'm not going to get into all of the rolling costs, but there's inflation and there's the opportunity costs of I could have put the money into some sort of stock or some sort of bond or some GIC or whatever it is, right? So it costs, $100,000, $150,000 all told. You say, well, it's only a $20,000 car. Yes, but the overall cost over 10 years is very significant. And so that is everything that you have to take into account when you are charging people for that car. And if you overcharge people for that car, then you'll be undercut by somebody who is going to charge a more reasonable amount in a free market scenario. So you can't just say, well, there's a point at which the car is paid off, and after that, it's all profit. Because if you can rent this car out for $5,000 a day, well, you say, okay, well, then the car is paid off in like a week or two, and the rest of it is pure profit. But the point is, of course, nobody's going to rent your car for $5,000 a day. If you do the actual math, or if you actually run a business rather than read about running businesses, you'll very quickly find out that the amount of money that people charge for stuff kind of mirrors its cost of ownership, cost of operation, its opportunity costs of the money you had to invest to buy it, and depreciation value as well. It does kind of mirror that. In other words, the price of loaning out your car turns out to be a little bit more than all of the money that you've lost or spent in having that car for 10 years. So there is no magic point. It's a soft landing. It's a really soft landing for it. There's no point at which you say, oh, now it's all pure profit, because anybody who does that is overcharging, we undercut in the marketplace.
Okay, now that assumes that assumes a market that one doesn't exist, or one that would work absolutely perfectly. Now, that being said, there would be.
Oh, hang on. Big statement, Kevin.
I know, because I'll explain it. What I'm saying.
I know. What does absolutely perfectly mean? I don't know what that means.
Because if that was the case, where would any profit be generated? How could profit be generated? Because if the market was so efficient at basically finding out where things are overcharged and all that kind of stuff, then you'd essentially, it would bring it down so that profit would be so, like, you'd have such minuscule amounts of profit, because as soon as you start making the profit, which is obviously the more that basically the higher cost you can charge for something more than the cost it costs you, how could there be the generation of profit if the market is so efficient at finding where the equilibrium between the cost and the price is so perfect? I mean, the profit wouldn't exist.
Do you want an answer for that, or do you want to just keep asking the question?
Well, if you want to think I'm disingenuous, you're reading a book.
No. I mean, just because I thought you finished asking the question, then you just kept going. And if you want to keep going, I'm happy to listen. But I thought you asked a good question. I'd like to take a swing at answering it.
Don't have to interrupt to answer the question. So go ahead.
All right. So, profit is what draws people into the creation of stuff. In other words, let's say that I said to you, hey, man, I got a great idea. I want you to work 14 hours a day for 3 years, and I'm going to pay you $1. You'd be like, no, not going to do it, right? So profit is what you pay to get entrepreneurs to create stuff. And people always like new stuff. They like cool stuff. They like great stuff. And so in an interesting way, if business grinds profit down so low, then what happens is entrepreneurs are no longer attracted to that environment. In other words, if a profit is only 1%, or 1.5% or whatever, what that indicates is that there are too many entrepreneurs in that particular area. And so what happens is entrepreneurs stop going into that particular area, and they start going somewhere else where there's more profit to be had. They create new stuff. They upgrade stuff, right? You used to be able to make a lot of money selling telephone switching boards. You can't do that so much anymore. You used to be able to make a lot of money selling cell phones the size of Kleenex boxes that you had to point at the sky and couldn't stand under a tree in order to have them work. Can't make that rotary dial phones. You sort of get the general idea. And so because people are constantly, the creative destruction of the free market, there's constant change, constant opportunities for new profit. There's no equilibrium in the free market because all resources are finite and all human desires are functionally infinite. And therefore, there's always things that people want: better, faster, more efficient, more colorful, more pretty, more enjoyable, better smelling, more sexy, whatever it's going to be. So there's really no practical limit to the possibilities that can generate profit. But if you're looking at a perfectly static free market, you're not looking at a free market. You're looking at, I don't know, some centrally planned chaos mess currently descending into the worst stereotype of anarchy that you could imagine, but enough about fiat currency. And so in a free market, you are constantly leaping over other people. You are constantly creating new things that displace prior industries, right? So that there used to be a great business shoveling horse crap in New York City because they used horses and, they just crapped everywhere. And then cars came along and that job so the people who invested in horse and buggy manufacturing, their profits declined, which was a signal to say, when profits decline, it means either that the market is overcrowded, which means that too many goods are being produced, which is going to drive down consumer demand, or consumer demand is evaporating on its own, just as it did for Rodu dial phones and the horse and buggy and so on, which means that entrepreneurs should start focusing society's scarce resources on some other area that is going to further satisfy the customers. And the first people who go to market with that kind of stuff generally get to reap the rewards of being first to market with that stuff. And so there's the profits tend to be highest in new areas that have created their own demand, right? So nobody thought they really needed a cell phone until there were cell phones. And then nobody thought they needed a flat screen touch phone until they became popular. Nobody ever thought, well, I need high definition video recording in my pocket until, right? So sometimes the supply creates its own demand, and that tends to be where the most profits are. So people are constantly trying to create cool new stuff to sell to people because that's where the greatest profits are. And then there's a long tail of industries that are usually seeing diminishing profits because consumer demand is either shifting to new stuff or just diminishing on its own. So there's no static area where you're going to say, well, in a perfect free market, all profits go to zero. That simply can't happen because we are insatiable in our thirst for new stuff.
How do you understand profits from older businesses then, from, you might say oil producers or something like that?
I don't know what you mean. I'm not sure what you mean.
What you're suggesting, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the generation of, if the market tends towards an equilibrium in some area, the overall non-equilibrium in the market is in some ways generated by the constant quote unquote creative destruction and the entrepreneurial activity of seeking out new and innovative products that will either create its own or fill some kind of demand. And that those entities which are able to capture the market quicker are the ones who realize profits. Otherwise, there's a general declining rate of the profit as either the commodity gets older or there is some kind of means by which the demand falls off, or the prices get too high because demand's high and supply's low. I mean, what I'm asking is, in businesses where there is not a lot of innovation in terms of real entrepreneurship, but there's still high rates of profit, what accounts for that?
And were you referring to the oil industry in particular?
That's a profitable industry, but yeah.
Okay, so there's two major reasons. Yeah, there are two major reasons, Kevin, why the oil industry is so profitable. One has to do with the free market, and one really doesn't. Of course, the one which doesn't, which you're aware of course, is that the oil industry has, at least in the Middle East, right, in the biggest oil-producing nations, doesn't have anything to do with the free market. It's a fascistic oligarchy, right, a theocracy of state-run capitalism that runs this stuff. So it's, and the OPEC thing, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries.
Subsidies here, yeah.
Right. Oh God, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Subsidies, right, and the other thing too, if you love environmentalism, and by that I don't mean care for nature, but the watermelon stuff, green on the outside, red, or communist on the inside. I'm not speaking to you. I'm just speaking to the audience as a whole. The who's responsible for all of the mess that is going on in the Middle East? Well, environmentalists to a large degree, because the Middle East was dirt poor, and Muslims were dirt poor and pretty limited in their scope until environmentalists stopped people from doing a lot of drilling and exploration for oil in the West, and therefore they had to get all their oil from the East, which put huge amounts of money into Muslim theocracies and dictatorships. And so that's the non-free market side of things. Yeah, subsidies, regulations, you name it. I mean, it's insane how little of that aspect. But on the other hand, another reason why profits remain high in the oil business is that the oil business is constantly changing. We used to just be able to drill like a toothpick being pushed into sand. Used to be able to drill down and suck the oil up out of the ground. Now all of that stuff has been exploited. The stuff close to the surface where there's a big pool, you stick a straw in and slurp it out. Now of course, there's shale and all other kinds of fracking and so on, ways of producing oil. But there's also this really weird stuff where you've got these flexible straws, these flexible, they can drill around shelves of rock, go underneath and slurp up stuff that they couldn't have gotten through before because they'd have to drill through half a mile of rock. There's some really wild stuff that is going on in terms of oil exploration that has been going on for the last generation or so, since the easy stuff got kind of pulled up. And so there is a huge amount of innovation and creativity in the engineering and extraction side of the oil business that makes it very entrepreneurial. They're not just doing the same old stuff.
But they are essentially selling the same product, right? So in terms of from the consumer perspective, what I mean, I guess I don't see that doesn't even really matter. Here's a question that slightly switches gears, but I don't think so. I am 100% on your side when it comes to your critiques of the state and the sort of coercive aspect of the whole thing. It's monopoly use of power, all of that kind of stuff. So I'm in your camp on that. What I'm curious about is and I understand where you're coming from, and we have the disagreement that I think this will get to in terms of the sort of your anarcho-capitalist kind of mentality. And I would consider myself a sort of anarcho, maybe syndicalist would be a better way, maybe anarcho-communist, depending on what you want to call it. But so I agree with all your criticisms of the state and how the state obviously screws up market forces. It doesn't it doesn't allow for, whatever free market would come out of it, would happen if it didn't have that, if it wasn't so involved in that kind of stuff. But I'm curious why you think it's developed this way and who the state is supposed to serve. Because it appears to me that the reason the state is the way that it is and has the impact that it does, and we have a sort of state capitalist system, is in some ways because of the failure of systems that were more sort of let go, more laissez-faire, and had what I would consider some of the inherent problems of capitalism, such that the people the elite, who are the capitalists in the new era or in this era, essentially decided that the state was the way for them to retain their position of their elite position, and and so they do so by not only capturing as much of the market or industry as they can, but also the politics, thereby making sure that the state always does what they want them to do. I don't know if you disagree with that, you think that's how it's going, if there's something else to it. But why is it the way why are we in the situation that we are when we have a sort of state capitalist system? And who is the state actually serving?
Well, the state serves itself. But as to why we're in this situation, it's the pursuit of profit through the agency of the state. It's not cheating if it's allowed, right? Right? I mean, if it was disallowed to use your backhand in tennis, then you'd be cheating to use your backhand in tennis. But if you're allowed to use your backhand in tennis, like you're allowed to pick up a ball in rugby, but not soccer, so football. So it's not cheating if you're following by the rules. And unfortunately, the rules of state capitalism are that you will gain by far the most profit on average by manipulating the state into passing laws in your favor or passing laws against other people you're competing with. And also using the state to create and enforce monopolies, whether it's doctors or telecoms or whatever it is. And so because there is the state, and because the people in charge are paid for their ability to produce profit, and because utilization of the state is the best and most certain way to produce and maintain profit, that's exactly what happens. And there's simply no way it's not going to happen if there's a state. The anarcho part is simply a recognition that human beings cannot handle the power to initiate force. Human beings simply cannot handle the power to initiate force. You can't, I can't, no one can. So this is why we say to kids, don't hit. We don't say hit wisely. We don't say hit for the common good. Beat up Joey there for the collective excellence of mankind, right? We say don't hit. Because you can't say to a 3-year-old hit wisely, and you can't say to an adult human being use political power for the benefit of society. Nobody knows what the benefit of society is, because society is a vast aggregate of individuals acting for externally incomprehensible purposes. And a lot of times people don't even know what they're doing stuff for. Why did you become an artist? I don't know, just thought it was cool. Why did you become a guitarist? Well, everybody knows that one. So as long as you have a state, corporations, which are a creation of the state, are going to use the state to benefit, right? So in the US, they're currently trying to get hundreds and hundreds of thousands of third world workers to come in on these H-1B visa programs. Now, this originally started in the early 1950s, and the whole point was, if you had some super genius professor who wanted to come over and teach at Yale for a semester, you couldn't do it. So they created this sort of two classes of visas. One was for like super genius, the people who've got to wheel themselves across and speak at 45 degrees out of a voice box. Those people were supposed to come across and be able to get jobs easily because they're irreplaceable, one of a kind. And the other was like, super specialized people who you couldn't find in the United States. If you wanted somebody to translate Urdu into computer code, couldn't find someone like that in the States. Highly specialized, highly rare, and so on. And that was sort of the original point. And then, of course, what happened was through a bunch of backroom maneuvering and politics and bureaucracy, bureaucratic manipulation, and so on, they expanded these categories. And so now it's just guy with degree from, phoneitin.india or whatever, right? And so now they're just hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these low-rent, relatively low-skilled workers are pouring in and displacing American workers. You say, well, this is really bad. The capitalists shouldn't be doing this. It's like, no, the capitalists have to be doing this because if they don't, they go out of business, right? So your fiduciary responsibility as an executive in a corporation is to maximize shareholder value by growing the business, by paying less, and all that kind of stuff, right? And so if you have the power of the state and you don't use it, then your competitors are going to use it. And no one's going to play that prisoner's dilemma saying, hey, let's none of us go for state, because the first person to break that is going to. So if you're in a room and there's a gun and the other guy is going to go for it and shoot you, you have no choice but to try and go for it. And so as a business, it is irresponsible. It's an abridging or a countervailing of your fiduciary responsibility to produce value for your employees, your shareholders, your customers, and so on. You have to pursue state power, which is one of the reasons why Donald Trump is so unpopular these days, because he can't be bought off. And these guys have invested a huge amount in owning Congress people, right? And so they've grown, they specialize that way. And so if he comes in and shuts off the H-1B visa spigot, well, there's going to be a significant crash in the market. And good, because, there are lots of people who've lots of skills. Say, oh, there's a shortage of STEM workers. It's bullshit. It's complete bullshit. They say there's a shortage of STEM workers so the government can credibly sign all these H-1B visas, which is supposed to bring in all these STEM workers. But 40% of people with a master's or a PhD in the STEM fields end up working outside their field because they can't find jobs inside their field because they're being viciously undercut by cut price imported labor. And so this is, this modern day serfdom. And these poor H-1B visa people, obviously it's better than where they came from, but, they're not really allowed to start their own businesses. They're not allowed to switch around. They can't really negotiate for better conditions and so on. You get these coding sweatshops and all that, and it's brutal and it's gruesome and it's horrible, and it requires a state in order to create and sustain it. But the reason the state power is there. The gun in the room is going to be used to rob someone. And if it's not you robbing them, it's them robbing you. So everyone is going to be grabbing for that gun and scrabbling for their gun. Just have to take the gun away because that's the only way we get to anything close to a sustainable free market.
Well, and as someone whose wife is on an H-1B visa, I'm very, very familiar with what you're talking about in regards to that. However, so the question is, essentially, so if I could kind of condense your position into one sentence, is that when you presuppose a state, right? You have a state, and you have the principle of profit and the motivation that comes from it. That motivation for generating as much profit as you possibly can will essentially force you to do what you can to take state power in order to maintain your profits and actually grow your profits, hopefully, because of your use.
Yeah, and if you won't do it, there's a guy down the hall who will.
Okay, so it's the issue of the reason why laissez-faire capitalism has never actually existed is because there's always been a state. Would that be fair for you to say?
Yes.
Okay. So your idea is if we remove the state, then laissez-faire capitalism can work perfectly. Or at least
again, I have no idea what the word perfectly means. I don't know what that means.
To the sort of general ideas of what makes
I don't know.
Free market.
I don't care how it works.
There's general principles of free market.
No, Kevin, I don't care how it works. I know that the initiation of force is immoral and the state is an agency of coercion. So you're asking me, well, if we get rid of slavery, will crops be picked perfectly? That's not what I'm hanging getting rid of slavery on. I don't care how the crops are picked. I know slavery is wrong. I don't care what happens afterwards. So as far as like, oh, will the free market have a chance to do X, Y, and Z? I don't care. The initiation of force is immoral. The state is an agency of coercion, an agency of violence, and it is wrong. It is wrong. It is as wrong as slavery. It is as wrong as rape. And so how do people get married if we don't force them to rape each other? I don't care. I don't know. Something will come along and I don't even care what it is. But I do care that the fundamental moral stain that's currently at the heart of society gets at least challenged on its ethical basis.
Well, and I'm in agreement with that from the but the sort of question I have, or I think where the interesting sort of dialogue between you and me would be if you don't have a state, so you don't have the whole coercive influence of the state at all, and so then your I don't know if it's your position or if you just think that if you had a society that didn't have a state and was based on a certain set of principles, like non-aggression and things like that, that the sort of market system from property rights would then develop and would at least be allowed to function without the coercive influence of the state, thereby using things like the market forces, price determinations, things like that would be able to work in a way where the system would sort of work. Is that fair? I mean, it would work.
Again, I don't know what work means. If you have a society that's founded on the let me finish. If you have a society that's founded on the non-aggression principle, then all interactions are voluntary. Now, does that mean people aren't going to make mistakes? Of course they're going to make mistakes. So like a perfect free market, who knows? People are going to invest in spaceships that turn over sideways and blow up, right? People are going to invest in some crop that fails. They're going to buy turkey farms, and the turkeys are all going to get hit by plague or drought. They're going to buy a house next to a river that overflows and destroys them. There's always going to be problems. Right?
Yeah, I mean,
that's natural. Yeah. There's always risk in human life. So I don't know what perfect or any of that means, but what I do know is, so if we stop putting a gun to everyone's head and making them rape each other, people might still break up. They might still cry and listen to too many Adele songs, right? So, but the point is that if you are not forcing people to get married and have sex with each other, all the resulting relationships will be voluntary. Now, does that mean they'll be perfect? Of course not. I don't even know what that would mean, but they're voluntary, which means that nobody's got a gun to their head. And that means some people are going to accept too little money and some people are going to ask for too much money. And some people are going to have buyer's remorse. They're going to buy a house and they're going to look at it the next day and say, I hate this place for whatever reason. That's going to happen. But it's voluntary. Now, what happens after things become voluntary? I don't know. I don't care. It doesn't matter. Because if I did care and it did matter, what happened after human relations become voluntary, it would mean I would be back in the fascist seat of central planning again. All I want is for people to be free, to make their mistakes, to interact with voluntary, to grow, to learn, to love, to fail, as they see fit according to their own conscience and their own choices. How that shakes out in the world, I couldn't care less, because there's no way to know. If you could know, it'd be an argument for the state again.
Sure, I mean, of course, but you would have. I agree with all that, except for that you would have at least some idea of what you would advocate for in terms of that organization. So not the position where you'd say do this or I'll kill you or I'll find a bunch of people and we'll all come after you or anything like that. But that you would say, okay, now that we have a system that's based on pure voluntarism, this is the best way that we can organize ourselves to be able to accomplish goals, whether that goal be the fulfillment of human. I mean, it depends on what the goals are, right? I mean, I think those are really important things that matter in terms of. See, what do you mean?
There are no collective goals in a free society. Like if in North Korea, the government runs the entire movie industry, and if you don't do what the government says, you get shot or whatever, right? Now, it's sort of like saying, well, how will propaganda be run if the government gets completely out of the movie industry? Well, it won't be propaganda anymore. And so what are the central plans and goals of society? How is society going to be run? How's it going to function? Doesn't matter. When you have a free society, everybody is pursuing their own individual goals. Now, they may come together for collective projects, and they certainly will come together for, the barn raising of the Amish household or whatever. They will get together, but there's no central planner anymore, and it's a tough thing to get your head around. There's nobody sitting there saying, well, I think society should go like this, and I don't think society is working as well as it should be over there, so I'm going to go in and fix it. And there's no one like that. This power doesn't exist. You can reason with people, you can make your case, you can give charity, you can organize people as much as you want voluntarily, but there's no one directing anything from a central planning standpoint.
And I get that entirely, but you can't. There is going to be a form of organization if there isn't a state. Right? What doesn't have to have the aspects of a state. It doesn't have to have monopoly. You have the monopoly use of force. It wouldn't have to have that. But there is going to be organizations. There are going to be social and economic interactions, and those will have to abide by a certain set of, at least not necessarily rules per se, but a certain sort of organizational structure, and they will have common ways of dealing with one another. I mean, the idea I'm getting at is that you, while advocating for anarchism, which I agree with, at the same time advocate for this kind of capitalism, sort of free market capitalism. And so it would seem to me that if you were in support of an anarchist system, one that doesn't involve a coercive state, you would still, in a system that didn't have that state, advocate for a capitalist mode of production, distribution, economic interaction.
No, I would do no such thing.
Okay, all right.
I would do no such thing.
Right,
however people want to set their lives up in a free society is none of my goddamn business. If you want to have a syndicalist, anarcho-syndicalist area over there, go homestead some land, go buy some land, set up your Venus Project flytrap robot cities, go set up your anarcho-syndicalist. I don't care. Like, for me to say, well, you can't have commune, go have your communes. I don't care. I've got more to do with my life, being a husband, being a friend, being a philosopher, being a father. I have enough to do with my life without going over and church lady style finger wagging at other people's lifestyle choices. If you want to, all the workers want to get together, grab a factory that's not being used and take a loan out and dust it up and promote some egalitarian way of producing. I don't care. As long as they're not pointing guns at each other, as long as there's not a state pointing guns at everyone, I don't care. Like, do you care what color your neighbor paints his basement? You don't, because he's not using any force to do so. Now, if the government says everyone has to paint their basement puke green, well, suddenly you're going to care because now there's force involved. But I don't care what people do if there's no gun involved. I mean, I might, say, I think that you should, might be nice. You may be encouraging, like, you should go out and seize the day and achieve your life goals or whatever, but I don't care. If people want to organize themselves according to private property market principles, fine. I think that's more sustainable, but who cares, right? If there's some other experiment people want to undergo, fantastic. The beautiful thing about a free society is it allows for all kinds of test tubes of experimentation on the best way to do things. And, as long as you don't force me to live in your commune, I'm not going to force you to live on my street of private property. I mean, it's perfectly fine. I can't get engaged or interested enough. The whole point of philosophy is creating a society where you don't need to care about what your neighbors do that much. You can, in terms of like help them out, let them sugar and so on. But this busybodiness that comes from the state is something it's hard to imagine a society being free of. All right, man, I got to move on to the next caller, but I really appreciate your call. It was I know it was a bit contentious at times, but I hugely appreciated it and found it enormously fun and valuable. So, Kevin, a real pleasure. And all my best to your wife, and call back in anytime.
Let's do it again.
Yeah, thanks, man.
All right, so there was my conversation with Stephan Molyneux. As you can guess, that supposed second conversation never happened. I did try to reach out a few times to see if we could have part 2 of this, because I think there's obviously quite a bit left unsaid, but alas, no such meeting had ever happened. I even reached out to the Free Domain Radio Show and to Stephan individually to ask at least for permission to air this, and never actually heard anything even regarding that. So I'm not really sure what the situation is. I know obviously Stephan Molyneux has gotten attention for other things, including his race and IQ things and his recent trip to Poland, where he seemed to, well, he's a race realist, so he needs to look at the reality, and in all white Poland, it's great. So anyway, that was my conversation. Hope you got some enjoyment out of it, or at least found it somewhat interesting. I will try to reach out to Stephan again after this airs and see if we can't have a discussion about some of these kinds of issues, either on my podcast, or I'd be more than happy to go on his. So again, we're off for the next 2 weeks, but when I come back in 2 weeks, we'll have an exciting bunch of episodes for you, and we'll get back into it. Until then, be good. Solidarity forever. All right, bye.